Hello and welcome to the Master Voices podcast, where we invite a diverse range of masterful voices to explore subjects ranging from music and language to history and culture. This pod is a project of the New York City nonprofit Master Voices, formerly known as the Collegiate Chorale, which then, as now, is dedicated to the unique power of the human voice to connect, unite, and inspire. In the next 3 episodes, linguist, New York Times writer, and Gershwin enthusiast John McWhorter delves into the world of the Gershwin and Kaufman musical Strike Up the Band. You'll hear from theater historian Laurence Maslon, New Yorker cartoonist and editor Bob Mankoff, Maestro John McWhorter, and Master Voice's own maestro and artistic director Ted Sperling, as they unpack the many unique facets of the wholly unique Strike Up the Band. And now, without further ado, sit back and enjoy the Master Voices podcast.
So, folks, welcome to our podcast about the George Gershwin musical, Strike Up the Band. I should also mention that his brother Ira wrote the lyrics, and the original libretto was by the great George S. Kaufman. And what we're going to talk about today is the very interesting story of this musical that premiered in 1927. And at this recording, that's now 97 years ago. And it was playing in Philadelphia in its tryout and did not make it. And the historiography of the Gershwins is such that you almost can't believe that, especially in the 20s, they would have had a show that didn't make it. But the 1927 version just didn't work. But everybody involved was smart enough to know that it deserved another chance. And so instead of just going into the trunk forever, there was a second version of Strike Up the Band in 1930. And the Gershwins had Maury Riskind write a second book, similar but sweetened somewhat, literally, in that the original topic was a war over cheese. Now in 1930, the war is over chocolate. And more to the point, and we'll be doing a podcast about the music, but more to the point, the second version was dancier. It was hotter. They rewrote about half of the score, and a lot of the new songs had a certain kind of popcorn pep that probably made the 1930 experience a little more theatrical, a little more jazzy in this jazz age. And so with me today, I'm John McWhorter, is Maestro Ted Sperling, who will be conducting our concert of Strike Up the Band, or I should say his concert of Strike Up the Band, a few weeks from our recording, and Laurence Maslon, the august author on the history of musical theater and other subjects. And so, Ted, I wanted to kick it off to you. How does one do Strike Up the Band in a single evening when Strike Up the Band is actually 2 shows, each of which have full recordings, and it's an awful lot of music and different stories?
Well, one thing is you work with Larry Maslon. Delighted to be collaborating. We've been friends for a long time, and Larry is steeped in this era and in this genre. So I should mention I'm also going to be directing the evening, in addition to conducting. That's something that I do a lot with Master Voices. And we're not doing a full-out production, obviously. We have around 2 weeks of rehearsal, but we're going to try to give you the sense that you saw the show, which is always what we try to do when we do a Broadway piece. There will be dancing, and for the first time in my tenure with Master Voices, we'll actually have tap dancing, which I'm really looking forward to. We're working with Allison Solomon, an up-and-coming choreographer that I'm having a great time with already. Our principle, and Larry, I'd love you to chime in on this, has been to try to synthesize the best elements of the 2 versions of the show. I think both of us love a lot about the 1927 version and think perhaps it was an outlier at the time. Don't forget, this was the same year of Showboat, and this is a show that takes a lot of inspiration from Gilbert and Sullivan. It's the first of 3 satirical operettas that the Gershwin brothers wrote. We've already done
George S. Kaufman.
Master Voices with George S. Kaufman and Maury Riskind, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So we've already done Of Thee I Sing and Let Him Eat Cake. I was drawn to Strike Up the Band not just to finish the trilogy, but because I always think about what's going on in our world and how can Master Voices concerts reflect and mirror that. And of course, we're heading right into a very contentious election. There's a lot of war going around in the world, unfortunately, right now. And tariffs are very much on people's minds.
Mhm.
And so those are all subjects that of the Strike Up the Band tackles head on.
And cheese is an eternal topic for the American people.
We never quite get
we've
over it.
Yes.
That's right. We've made the decision that we want to sing about cheese. The rhymes are better, and it's a little sillier, I think, in a way.
Yeah, it's better.
So we'll talk about our adaptation, but generally speaking, I think we're trying to make the story as strong as possible, the jokes as funny as possible, and the music as memorable as possible.
And I think to your point, John, I appreciate being referred to as august, but it's only September. So we'll move into October with this concert, October 29th, right, Ted? I think that's the
correct,
date.
at Carnegie Hall.
Ted's really spot on by saying, 1927 was Showboat, which everyone has and all the history books say is the great first integrated, I hate that term, so maybe a better term is the first great narrative musical. And that opened a couple days after Christmas in 27. But this tried to open, as you said, John, out of town in Philadelphia. And it's a very strong narrative musical. I mean, it is not fluff by any stretch of the imagination. And that may be what got itself tripped up. George S. Kaufman was, if you can imagine this, a highly articulate, intelligent writer for the New York Times, just like you, John. And
Exact same thing.
and in 1919, he started writing plays because this was the era between the wars of, the New Yorker would start a couple years later, the Herald Tribune, the Times, and all these folks hung out at the Algonquin Hotel, at the Algonquin Round Table, Alexander Wolcott and Benchley and Dorothy Parker, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, Kaufman thought, why don't I try my hand at writing comedies? And by 1925, 26, he really had made a name for himself. He had done a couple of plays with Mark Connolly, Beggar on Horseback, which was very successful. But most pertinent to our case, in my opinion, in 1925, he wrote the first legitimate book show for the Marx Brothers called The Coconuts, with a score by Irving Berlin, which was a huge hit and really established the Marx Brothers as Broadway personalities. And so a couple years later, he was hired by this producer named Edgar Selwyn to write something with the Gershwins, who couldn't be hotter either. I mean, these are highly combustible, giants of the American theater. And he decided to write something topical and satirical, which he almost always did, which was a satire about kind of America's position between the two wars. And it was now what, well, you would know better than I, John, but I don't think the phrase superpower had been coined yet.
But that sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah, it certainly bestrode the world scene by 1927.
Newly, that was the new feeling of being an American and this nation.
Right, and there's a few lines about, we won the last war. What are we going to do now? What are we going to be?
Mm-hmm.
And it also taps into this wave in the 1920s of self-promotion and being a company and a sort of, as Ted put it, and I think a press release, a kind of Babbittry, what it meant to be head of a big company and what was the blurring line between economics and political power, something we have not exactly lost.
Yeah, the middle-aged men in this show are Babbitts. They are Sinclair Lewis characters, and the whole atmosphere is very post-Theodore Roosevelt in that sense. This is that America. Yeah.
I think so. And Kaufman looks at it, as he looked at everything, with skepticism and ridicule. And certainly people who had a certain kind of pomposity deserve to be punctured almost immediately. And it was sharp for its time. It was, I think, a little narratively sophisticated for its time. And it certainly was poking holes at things that musicals never, ever did by 1927. Maybe a few review sketches, but not a full-scale musical.
Yeah, it must have really thrown audiences at the time as sweet and even cute as it can seem to us. Go ahead, Larry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, I think that would have been the context, sweet and cute. And something came, so within that icing on the chocolate cake came some vinegar.
Mm-hmm.
And I gather out of town in Philadelphia, which is what they used to do. They used to take these big shows out of town. It did well for a week or two and then didn't really have great comedians in it. It had Larry Hart's brother, Teddy Hart, who was not on the he was sort of a B-list comedian, and it sort of petered out, and they had to close it. And one of the great comments that comes out of the show is Kaufman was asked to describe satire, and he said satire is what closes on Saturday night, referring to this failure. The irony, from my point of view, is there hasn't been a Saturday night since 1927 where there isn't a George S. Kaufman satire playing somewhere in the world.
Yeah.
So we'll talk a little bit about how this ship sort of righted itself. But I think the quote unquote failure of Strike Up the Band out of town has somewhat overshadowed what I think, and I'm sure Ted will talk about this as well. When you really dig into it, it's a tremendously ambitious, smart, and still relevant show.
Very much so. And the thing about this one is that, imagining the historical context, people are used to No No Nanette, or the Gershwins had just done okay. These are shows that were delightful, but they really weren't about a whole lot of anything. Even if the music was very good, the plots were piffle, and nobody really had any problem with that. Then all of a sudden, here is Strike Up the Band, where the plot is one that, for one thing, you have to follow. I remember seeing a Philadelphia production of this in 1984 when I didn't know a thing about musicals. I was interested in this Gershwin musical that I could see, but I had not been bitten by the show music bug yet. I was 19. So I went and saw this production, had no idea what I was going to see, fell instantly in love with the whole thing. Right down to the orchestrations, which for some reason, anybody who was there who was a grown-up says there was something wrong with that production, but I didn't know any better, and I thought it was just amazing. And the thing that I remember thinking is, hey, that actually had a plot, that the plot was actually a little bit sour in places, and I actually had to pay attention because I was thinking it was going to be No No Nanette or the likes of that, which I knew from middle school and high school having seen. So yeah, there was a lot there. And I wanted to insert something about Kaufman. I have always thought that he must have been relieved to do Strike Up the Band, even though it didn't work, because they actually did his lines. There's a Kaufman anecdote that he's at the Coconuts, at a rehearsal of the Coconuts, the Berlin show, and he interrupts his conversation with someone and says, wait.
No, he's in the lobby.
Wait.
He's in the lobby while the show is going on.
Right.
Yeah.
He says, wait, I just heard one of my lines, because the Marxes improvised so much. That did not happen for Strike Up the Band. So he must have enjoyed listening to his actual work.
Well, I think that was the Prince Music Theater, or it may have been called something else back then in Philadelphia. And we're grateful for them to breaking ground on that. But the way in for me, because Ted and I have worked to do a new adaptation of this text, which we can talk more about, is I know I wrote the liner notes to the some of the liner notes to the studio album that came out in the 90s. And it occurred to me when I looked at the Kaufman chronology, he wrote Strike Up the Band in between writing The Coconuts in 25 and Animal Crackers in 28. And he must have had the Marx Brothers on the brain. He was friends with them. He hung out with them. Coconuts toured. It went to London. They were very much not in the zeitgeist even. They were very much in his circle. And when I looked at it, I said, I think he kind of wrote this for the Marx Brothers, either consciously or unconsciously. And that helped me unlock what could be a solution to this show, because in a weird way, he's written the template for Duck Soup, which I think is 34. I think it's 34. So
Paramount. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you go, oh, what would the show be like if he had Groucho and Margaret Dumont? There's a big Margaret Dumont character. Groucho is clearly in the character of Fletcher, who owns the cheese factory. And this anarchic, crazy comedy around the periphery is clearly Chico and Harpo. So that helped me go, oh, let's try it that way. Maybe audiences could get in the front door on this very complex property if we kind of thought about it in that with those parameters.
So in the new version, and folks, this is a genuine question. I have not experienced it yet. In the new version, do we have a Bobby Clark and Paul McCullough? Are we keeping those two characters as the comic pair, or are we doing the George Spelvin thing from 1927 where there's just one guy?
Well, let's explain just to our audience who may not know the show at all.
Right.
That this anarchic quality to the show comes through a character that keeps drifting in and out and causing chaos, and then at the end proves to have been on one track all along. In the 1927 version, the name of the character is Spelvin, George Spelvin, and he transforms from scene to scene as necessary. And then I think one of the reasons perhaps that the 1930s version took off more is that they cast a very popular comedy duo that you referred to, which were more
Clark
like
and McCullough.
Right, sort of an Abbott and Costello
Exactly.
kind of pairing with sort of the smart one and the dumb one.
Right.
And they, I think, probably had a fan base, and they incorporated their shtick into the show. In fact, the script that we have from 1930 is an early script. It's not necessarily the performance script. And it will have scenes where it just says, business with cigar, continued business with cigar. And so they clearly had some cigar act, and then they worked it into the show.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that we are still figuring out for our concert version. I think for a future fully staged version, the preference would be to have a duo.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the kind of shtick I was just describing, that kind of thing sometimes takes a lifetime to refine. These vaudeville acts would refine an act and do it for the rest of their careers. We have 2 weeks. And we're also at Carnegie Hall, which is a very big room. So we're trying to figure out what's going to be the funniest and most successful version for our concert, and then have another look at what might be the best solution for a stage version.
For the record, this cigar thing was that they would walk out, and what was it, Larry? Bobby Clark would drop the cigar, and Paul McCullough would try to pick it up, and Bobby Clark would take it back. For some reason, that was funny.
Yeah, I mean, to say that Clark and McCullough were the Abbott and Costello of their day, I mean, for my money, Abbott and Costello are like Noel Coward and Terrence Rattigan compared to Clark and McCullough. You can see them on YouTube.
Yeah.
Bobby Clark made a famous
They did
career.
some films too.
They did some little shorts. Yeah. He had painted on glasses. He had a cigar. He had a very brash manner.
It's a mystery today. Yeah.
McCullough sort of stands around and tidies up, They're not, for my money, I love American comedy. They're not the A-team, although they were very, 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 very successful. But they were what I would call parachute comedians, by which I mean their gag and their routines and the audience expectation was so clear that you could parachute them into any scenario and you'd be off and running, just the way you could parachute Abbott and Costello into recruiting in World War II and you get buck privates, or you could parachute the Marx Brothers into Fredonia and get duck soup.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the ongoing challenge, Ted is right. We're a servant of two masters. We want to do a concert, and then we hope, because we can, the original 27 is actually in public domain, we can reconceive a version that will hopefully be so astonishingly successful that everyone will want to do it.
5 years on Broadway. Yeah.
Right. How do you create a comedy team from scratch? But I'm of the opinion that the way this show did work was the audience had some expectation for what that comedy team was. They didn't have to figure it out from scratch. And we're going to lean a little into the Marx Brothers there, I think, so that the audience goes, oh, I think I know what's going to happen if this guy winds up in this situation, which is part of the fun. And as you quite rightly say, this is the era of Eddie Cantor and Jimmy Durante and Fanny Brice and Clark and McCullough and the Marx Brothers. So these shows were written to give them room to do their thing. And I think Kaufman, being more of the craftsman than many, many, many of these writers in the 20s, sort of knew where he wanted them to land and how he wanted the scenes to go.
Yeah. It's a fascinating piece in so many ways. There's a genius in it in a lot of ways, because it is very Gilbert and Sullivan-esque. I would say that the 27 more so than the 1930. Not what you would expect from a vernacular American musical. And it has to be remembered how long ago, 100 years ago now was. 1927 was very different from now in a lot of ways. In 1927, you probably, unless you were Italian, had never eaten broccoli, and you had never eaten pizza. That was not regular food yet. In 1924, immigration, especially from Southern Europe and brown-skinned countries, had been largely barred. And so we were now past the era of large numbers of, for example, Italian people and Jewish people coming into the country. In 1927, if you went to the movies, it was silent. So Jazz Singer, 1927, that's just that year. Not everybody saw it. Before that, there had been a few sound film shorts, but film was silent. And of course, in 1927, Calvin Coolidge is the president. We have Silent Cal. And when he passed away, Dorothy Parker said, "How could they tell?" That was the sort of president that he was. And so people finding an evening's entertainment were coming in from the 1920s, when also I was told by somebody who was very much alive in the 20s, about 30 years ago, that women tended to wear stronger smelling perfume than they do today. The world smelled like Chanel No. 5 in 1927. I know that's trivial, but I just wanted to get that in. And so Strike Up the Band is in that world. And of course, the music is spectacular. In many cases, it's very much ahead of its time for American music. I imagine, Ted, that's a lot of what interested you in this piece.
Yes, I always, start with something I love. I don't really like to spend weeks and weeks preparing for something that I'm not in love with. So that's number one. And also, our group does everything from Broadway to opera and contemporary music. So there's a certain standard that the chorus expects to be working on. So I like to find pieces that are challenging for the chorus. And then for the principals, it also has to be worth it to learn something this quickly, to put so much energy into it. But the principals who work with us always leave feeling like, I would never have done that if you hadn't asked, and I'm so glad I did.
Maestro Sperling, may I ask a question? You have a chorus, and you've got all these syllables going by, and it's in English. How do you get the diction? How do you manage to make it so that we out in the audience can understand? I've always wondered how you did that.
I have my own approach, which is not necessarily widespread. So my main thing is, I say to the chorus, after we've learned it, I do go through some very specific cutoffs, and I'm on a rampage with the chorus for several years now, because everybody pays a lot of attention to when a note begins, but very few people pay attention to when a note ends. And so the tendency is always to hang on to the last note too long. So I am very specific about cutoffs, and often that's what helps you understand a word is, a word's not done till it's done, unless it ends with a vowel. If it ends with an open vowel, you know what the word is right from the beginning. But if it has a final consonant, you don't know what we're saying until we finish it. So I do make sure everybody finishes together. But the other thing is, I say you have to mean it. You have to actually be singing like you made this up. Like this is a thought that just occurred to you that you want to express. Right. And so if it's dead and if it's flat, then it's not going to register. But if you sing it like you mean it, it will suddenly come to life. And the other thing is that I believe in singing as much as possible the way we talk. So I don't actually love it when people are over-enunciating when they sing, because it sounds phony to me. So I try to strike that balance between sometimes not saying a final consonant, because we wouldn't when we speak. We elide things. And sometimes that's great for me with singing. And then there are some other places where I think, no, we have to make this note shorter so we can really understand it.
Exactly.
Like the word strike up the band. If you're going to strike up, like strike cup, we don't want it to sound like there's a stry cup somewhere. It's strike up. So I make the word strike shorter than written sometimes.
Right. Larry, I wanted to ask you something about legacy on this show.
Sure.
We're in 1927, such an important year in so many ways, in so many areas. So you've got the 1927 edition of Strike Up the Band. It flops in Philadelphia. Showboat is, as we've said, 1927. And then Strike Up the Band makes a hit in 1930. Did it have a legacy? Did it affect the development of the form, or was it just a one-off Strike Up the Band? Because Showboat essentially was. Showboat did not change musical theater then. Did Strike Up the Band change things?
1943, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Till Oklahoma. That's an excellent question. I think you left out one very important date and milestone, which is the Depression, the stock market crash in 29.
Yeah.
So you might say that's the kind of tipping point where, Strike Up the Band was the first musical, the revised version by Maury Riskind, who was a friend of Kaufman's. It wasn't antagonistic at all. Kaufman said, hey, I did what I could. You want to take a crack at it? Go ahead. And there's a lot of Kaufman in the 1930 version. One could argue the best part of the 30 version. And the Depression happened, and Strike Up the Band was the first musical to open the 1930s. It opened the first week of 1930. And, what people wanted changed. Maybe they weren't so interested in pointed political satire because their life had become pointed political satire. And Riskind himself said when he inherited Clark and McCullough, I had to rewrite War and Peace for the Three Stooges. And you can tell I hate to use the phrase dumbed down. You would come up with a better phrase. It's denatured. How about that? Is that a better
Yeah.
phrase?
Yeah.
And it's a little simplistic. It's a dream sequence, which is always a cop out, in my opinion. So you might look at in two levels. What people are going to see in October is the 1927 version running at 30 miles an hour, and the 1930 version running at 30 miles an hour into each other, smack like in a Warner Brothers cartoon. And the explosion is kind of the best bit. Certainly, we went and cherry picked the best songs because Ira Gershwin was an acolyte of W.S. Gilbert. It's probably among the most American take on that kind of style. And I think we've tried to find a slightly cleaner plot. I hate to even use the word plot in a musical written between 1927 and 1930, but I think we found a way for audiences to get on board. I think we have different expectations of characters. I think in 2024, it's a little harder to lean back and say, here's where the boy and the girl do their tap bit. We like a little bit of motivation sprinkled in there.
Oh, really?
Um,
So it's not they're not just going to come out and sing and tap, which I kind of enjoy sometimes.
yeah, they are, but you'll sort of know
They have to say
why. How
something,
about
right?
this? Now
Yeah.
you'll know why.
Been a
But I
long
actually
day. Yeah.
have a question for you, John. You're the
Shoot.
best person in the world to ask this question. So, in revising the book, we've had to cut some elisions and create some new situations and so on and so forth. And because it does exist in this limbo between 27 and 30, I've had to be very careful about my word choices.
Hmm.
And I pull out my Random House Dictionary of American Slang to see when they land. And the word slacker actually appears in the original script, surprising to me.
In today's meaning? Huh.
Yeah,
Interesting.
actually. But the
Huh.
word I couldn't pin down was the word hack in the way we use someone who's sort of second rate and hackneyed, a political hack. And it didn't, I can't find it anywhere.
I don't think that word is used that way then. It's only used as a vehicle.
Uh-huh.
You hire a hack. But no, I've never seen it in any pop culture source of that time. And I don't have my books with me right now, but my intuition is that no, he's just a hack. Would not be something somebody said in 1927.
And
I don't think so.
what do you use as your barometer for like when words are in common usage at a certain time? Because the last thing I want is for words that appear in common parlance to disrupt
Sure.
the surface tension of the show.
You do two things. There is something called the Online Etymological Dictionary, and
Okay.
that sounds kind of cheap, and you're wondering whether, but actually the people who put it together are excellent, and so they almost never mess up. Then also you get a subscription to the Oxford English Dictionary, and you don't bother with the big giant navy colored volumes. Now it's online and they can add to it every 10 seconds, and that will tell you all that is known generally since last week about the history of a word. And so hack, actually, when you said that, I thought I'm going to go look at the OED after we finish taping for hack. And if you can't find it in either one of those places, then you can be pretty sure, although if you really get obsessed about things like this, you can also do hack and then 1927, see what comes up, and then
Oh.
try hack 1900 and see if something comes up in some ancient, farming document or something like that. So those are the three things that I do when I'm putting together my I do a language podcast called Lexicon Valley for if I'm writing a column. So yeah, but hack I don't know, but it doesn't feel right to me. No.
Can I
Okay.
throw in one word that's jumped out at me? that I don't think we use anymore, but it's in the score and it's in a very famous standard from that era, which is the word chaff, chaff.
Where's chaff in it?
So I gaily chaffed, from.
Oh yeah, that's right.
It's in one of the choruses. We were just working on like one of the finalettos, of which there are two in this piece. They're mid-act finales. But that's a word that I just screams the 1920s to me.
Oh, it's also in Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, isn't it?
That's the one. So I laughed and gaily chaffed.
Yeah.
Right. I wanted to say just a couple of things just for our future audiences, and I hope everybody who's listening is going to come. Larry was saying we were picking and choosing the best, but sometimes you do have to leave out some of your favorite things. And there's a song that was written for 1930, which became a minor standard called Soon. And it's a love duet for the main couple.
I remember my heart swelled hearing it in Philadelphia in 1984. Yeah.
It's a beautiful tune, and it actually was born of some material from the 1927 score. That tune is used in these finalettos.
Jim, how can you do such a thing? Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Hired,
And some friends of the Gershwin said that's a tune, you should exploit it. So it became its own tune later. But as Larry was saying, we're trying to keep the plot airborne for the length of the evening. And in both of the versions that tend to get done, the two romantic couples, and there are two. There's sort of the more serious grown-up couple and the younger, more soubrette, juvenile couple. They both are sort of in love from the beginning, and the only obstacle to them is permission. For the younger couple, it's the Margaret Dumont character who has to say yes, and for the older couple, it's Mr. Fletcher. So Larry is investing more in these two romances and giving them the whole span of the evening to actually resolve, and the conflict comes from within the couples. So for either of them to sing Soon in the first act is very resolved. It's saying, soon we'll be together and our obstacles will be gone.
Right.
And since the obstacles are remaining through the show, we have not found yet a place for Soon in our version. So I don't want people to be disappointed. You will still hear the beautiful melody because it's in the 1927 finalettos, but you may not hear the full.
Oh well, no Soon. Oh, by the way, Strike Up the Band trivia. This is because this will be the only place I will ever have a reason to mention this. Philadelphia. The Margaret Dumont character is Edna May Oliver, who was the kind of you're right, yeah. And she left the show as it wasn't working out, so she left. And you know what she then went to? Showboat, because she was Parthy in Showboat. There's that connection between Strike Up the Band and Showboat. Just wanted to get that in there. So anyway.
Amazing. And we were speaking about W.S. Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan fame. One of the nice little tidbits is that Ira Gershwin first encountered Gilbert's writing in a book and thought it was just poetry. He didn't know at first. He didn't know that it went with music.
Right.
And so that was a big light bulb moment for him as a teenager when he finally got to hear the music that went with these words that he loved so much.
You know, folks, one reason to experience Strike Up the Band is that, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, I have offended many people. Gilbert and Sullivan, I have great respect. Never loved them, not even the Mikado, not even Pirates. And part of it is that, frankly, I find the music rather unengaging. It's not surprising to me that Ira would see the lyrics and think that they didn't go to music. And the truth is, Strike Up the Band, to me, is Gilbert and Sullivan better because, you know, it's in our language and the music is, frankly, more interesting. It's the way I prefer to listen to Gilbert and Sullivan is to listen to Strike Up the Band.
Well, you know, if Strike Up the Bands, plural, did nothing more than to have a moment where George Kaufman and Maury Riskin, when the show opened in 1930, the story goes that they were watching it from the back of the orchestra. And during intermission, Kaufman turned to Maury and said, who is a Columbia graduate, by the way, John.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And said, you know what? Why don't we do the next one just for us? And the next one was Of Thee I Sing. Which, you know, won the Pulitzer Prize and is considered to be the gold standard, certainly of the three political musicals they did together with the Gershwins, a total landmark in the history of the American musical theater, and I think the most kind of fluent and cogent access or appropriation, if I'm allowed to use that word in this context, of the Gilbert and Sullivan style. So, it was the ultimate strike up the bands or the ultimate kind of workshop, right? It was for them to get their muscles going so that they could, in the depths of the Depression, a couple of years later, turn out this masterpiece.
Very much so. Yeah, I've always thought of it that way as well, that it steps things gradually up to what became, in my mind, of the cake. Basically those two
Right.
magnificent.
Strike up the cake. Strike thee the cake. There is one anecdote I feel like I must say, and Ted, by all means, feel free to use it in concert, is Kaufman, who was, I don't think of him so much as a curmudgeon. I think of him as an acerbic realist with a sense of humor. But he told this story that he was in a lobby, right? All these great anecdotes seem to happen in theater lobbies. And a man came up to him and said, "Oh, Mr. Gershwin, Mr. Gershwin." And Kaufman said, "Well, we're both tall, Jewish, dark hair, long chins." He said, "I didn't have time to interrupt the guy and tell him he had made a mistake." He said, "Oh, Mr. Gershwin, I love your work. But I put money into so many of your shows, and they've all been hits except one. I put money into Strike Up the Band in 1927, and I lost my shirt. Could you possibly tell me why that show failed?" And Kaufman said, "I gave the poor man the only possible answer I could think of. Kaufman gave me a lousy book."
With that, I think that our conversation on the historical circumstances of Strike Up the Band or Strike Up the Bands has come to a graceful end. And I have been so happy to be here with Maestro Sperling and Laurence Maslon, who is so talented and knowledgeable about so very many things. And please listen to our next edition of the podcast, where we're going to discuss other aspects of the circumstances surrounding the creation of this musicals, so to speak.
The concert is October 29th at Carnegie Hall, one night only. We have an all-star cast, and you can find out much more about our production by visiting MasterVoices.org, where you can also find a link to buy tickets.
Thank you for listening to the Master Voices podcast. To learn more about Master Voices, visit MasterVoices.org. You can discover our rich history, read chorus member spotlights, and buy tickets to upcoming performances. You can go there to support our work by making a tax-deductible donation. Your gift will allow us to continue our mission to spark greater human connections by reimagining what the choral experience can be. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.